Hello, I'm William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and several days ago, Pope Francis, or I should say the Vatican, published a document on the blessing of homosexual or same-sex couples. At least that's how it's presented in most discussions online in the media. What I'd like to do is I'd like to take some time and go through this actual document because based on what I see in terms of comments and arguments and discussions and criticisms, most of the Catholics talking about this situation in the church really have nothing to do with this situation, and they certainly haven't read this document. So what I'd like to do, especially for friends of mine, relatives of mine, families in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, or anyone who listens to talks or watches videos that I publish, I'd like to offer the opportunity to just walk through this document, see what it actually says, and understand what the Church is actually teaching us. For those who have a sort of Protestant self-confidence and think that they're above the magisterium, I'm really not interested in discussing Catholic doctrine with them because they don't have a right sentiment. Yesterday or the day before, if you look on the Academy website, I published a quote of one of the chapters in St. Ignatius of Loyola's spiritual exercises where he talks about having right sentiment in the church, having a right disposition as a Catholic. And you'll see that people who criticize the Pope and bishops and comment on political or moral subjects without even reading the Church's explanations, those people have problems. They don't have the right sentiment for the Catholic life. They don't have the right disposition that Catholics should have. And rather than get into wrangling with them over these controversial issues, it's more important to direct them to a document like the spiritual exercises to learn what a right sentiment is and how Catholics should think and approach the Church. So I think they have bigger problems to deal with than these controversial issues. And by the grace of God, we have the comfort of knowing that the Church is protected by the Holy Spirit and will lead us safely in matters of faith and morals until the end of time. So it's good for us to read these documents, to be quiet, like the Virgin Mary showed us to be quiet, to ponder these things in our hearts rather than react ignorantly and irrationally to them, allow our passions and other natural instincts to speak when really they're supposed to be filtered by reason. So I'd like to read through it. This may take a long time. There's like 40 paragraphs in this document, but I've got time today. My family's actually out roller skating as part of their Christmas break celebration, so I'm left home alone, as it were, free to have some fun. And for me, as bizarre as it may seem, this is what I consider to be fun. So let's look at this document. I've got it up on my screen here, and this was published on. Let's see, it was published on December 18th. At first I thought I was going to have to translate the Italian, but thankfully I don't need to do that because an English translation was provided. So we're just going to go through the English translation here, read it, see what the Church actually is talking about before we get into the political foolishness. See what the Church actually says, and I've already read this, so I know what it says. But we're going to see that the Church is calling us not to respond, not to talk about this, but to reflect on an important issue. And so I want to walk through, and the result of this should be that we've got something to think about, to ponder in our heart, and chew on. Not comment on, not criticize, not talk about, not respond to, but reflect on. We're being asked to reflect on a controversial issue under the direction of the spiritual director of the entire Catholic Church, Pope Francis. So if our sentiment is right, we should be ready to do that. So let's look at this. You can see up top, the title of the document is Fiducia Supplicans. Fiducia Supplicans, a Latin phrase. there's nothing fancy about this phrase. It's just the opening. I'll scroll down real quick. If you look down to the opening paragraph, that phrase, Fiducia Supplicans, it just means supplicating trust. It's the opening words of the document. So there's no jazzy message that's being communicated by the title. It's just the first words of the document, supplicating trust. So that's the title, but it's given this subtitle here, which really is more helpful, on the pastoral meaning of blessings. On the pastoral meaning of blessings. This is the subject of this document. And again, this was published on December 13th. On the pastoral meaning of blessings. So when we come away from this document, we should be thinking about the pastoral meaning of blessings. And we're going to get into the meaning of this subtitle as we go through the document. What I'd like to do is quickly read through this introduction here, very quickly, because it just establishes the context. And then I want to go through the document. Like I said, it may take some time. It's 40 paragraphs or so, and it's some pretty rich stuff that I think is worth thinking about, but I'd like, even as evidence of my own willingness and effort to go through it line by line, I'd like to do this and provide some commentary as we go. So let's get started here. On the pastoral meaning of blessings. This declaration considers several questions that have come to this dicastery in recent years. In preparing the document, the dicastery, as is its practice, consulted experts, undertook a careful drafting process, and discussed the text in the Congreso of the doctrinal section of the dicastery. During that time, the document was discussed with the Holy Father. Finally, the text of the declaration was submitted to the Holy Father for his review, and he approved it with his signature. So again, this isn't some off-the-cuff response to a question at a press conference. This is a carefully developed, edited, expert, consultants were sought. It was presented to the Holy Father. He reviewed it. He signed off. This is a carefully drafted, reviewed, sourced, and approved document. So let's read it with respect. While the subject matter of this document was being studied, the Holy Father's response to the dubia of some cardinals was made known. That response provided important clarifications for this reflection and represents a decisive element for the work of the dicastery. Since the Roman Curia is primarily an instrument at the service of the successor of Peter, our work must foster, along with an understanding of the Church's perennial doctrine, the reception of the Holy Father's teaching. As with the Holy Father's above-mentioned response to the dubia of the two cardinals, this declaration remains firm on the traditional doctrine of the Church about marriage, not allowing any type of liturgical rite or blessing similar to a liturgical rite that can create confusion. So there's no confusion about marriage. This is not about marriage or the sacrament of matrimony. This has nothing to do with that. Make sure you keep that in mind, because people will say things like, oh, the Pope approved gay marriage. That's absolutely false. We see this clarified right in the beginning. This declaration remains firm on the traditional doctrine of the Church about marriage, not allowing any type of liturgical rite or blessing similar to a liturgical rite that can create confusion. The value of this document is that it offers a specific and innovative contribution to the pastoral meaning of blessings. So we could say that we're witnessing the development of doctrine in this document, but it's restricted to one specific subject, namely the pastoral meaning of blessings in the Catholic Church, permitting a broadening and enrichment of the classical understanding of blessings, which is closely linked to a liturgical perspective. Such theological reflection, based on the pastoral, and you need to underscore pastoral, not doctrinal, but pastoral, practical, based on the pastoral vision of Pope Francis, implies a real development from what has been said about blessings in the magisterium and the official texts of the Church. This explains why this text has taken on the typology of a declaration. It is precisely in this context that one can understand the possibility of blessing couples, again, emphasis on blessings. It is precisely in this context that one can understand the possibility of blessing couples in irregular situations and same-sex couples without officially validating their status or changing in any way the Church's perennial teaching on marriage. In other words, we're talking about one specific subject, namely blessings and their role in the Church, the pastoral meaning of blessings. So you can take all the controversy about gay marriage and homosexuality and all of these broad general subjects and just set them aside, because the document makes very clear this is not some kind of broad universal teaching on any of those subjects. It's not about marriage in any sense. It's not about marriage. It's not about homosexuality. It's about a very specific application, namely blessing couples in irregular situations and same-sex couples without officially validating their status or changing in any way, the Church's perennial teaching on marriage. So take all of that political controversy, all of that gossipy nonsense, and just get it out of the way. None of it's true. This declaration is also intended as a tribute to the faithful people of God who worship the Lord with so many gestures of deep trust in His mercy, and who with this confidence in God's mercy, constantly come to seek a blessing from Mother Church. And so you can see this Fiducia Supplicans, that idea in the title. We all come to the Church, and it's really amazing to even think about the fact that we come to the Church at all. That's a reality that I think we need to learn not to take for granted, that the fact that people come to the Church at all is amazing, because they don't need to, especially in a democratic society where the whole society is secular, the economy is secular. There's no need to even come to the Church at all, and yet we find millions and millions of people coming to the Church. And they come to the Church trusting in God's mercy, asking for help. That's what we come to church for. We come asking for God's help. We seek a blessing. We ask for God's help, spiritual blessings. So let's remember the context in which all of us worship God. We all come to God as sinners, trusting in His mercy. And there's no other context for Christianity to even exist. So that's the presentation at the beginning, and now let's get into it. And you can see these paragraphs are numbered, so we'll refer to the paragraphs by number in any discussions, okay? Let's dig into this. We see the context. Now let's dig in. The supplicating trust of the faithful people of God receives the gift of blessing that flows from the heart of Christ through His Church. Pope Francis offers this timely reminder. The great blessing of God is Jesus Christ. He is the great gift of God, His own Son. He is a blessing for all humanity, a blessing that has saved us all. He is the eternal Word with whom the Father blessed us. And it's important to note, He blessed us while we were still sinners, as St. Paul says in Romans 5:8. He is the Word made flesh, who was offered for us on the cross. And remember, He was offered for us on the cross while we were still sinners. Not after we had converted, not after we had cleaned ourselves up. He offered himself for us. The whole history of salvation began and developed before any of us chose to be Christians. Paragraph 2. Encouraged by such a great and consoling or comforting truth, this dicastery has considered several questions of both a formal and an informal nature about the possibility of blessing same-sex couples. And this phrasing is important. In reasoning, when we talk about possibility, what we're asking, this is the question, when we talk about possibility, we ask whether something is impossible. So the question here is it impossible to reconcile granting a blessing to a same-sex couple? Is it impossible to justify that in light of church teaching? Is it impossible? Is there no possible way that it can be allowed? Because if that's the case, then it's not possible. And so we're asking about the possibility, whether there could be any way that it could be justified in the context of existing church teaching. So we're examining the possibility of blessing same-sex couples. And in light of Pope Francis's fatherly and pastoral approach to offering new clarifications on the responsum ad dubium that the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith published on February 22nd, 2021. The above-mentioned responsum elicited numerous and varied reactions. Some welcomed the clarity of the document and its consistency with the Church's perennial teaching. Others did not share the negative response that it gave to the question, or did not consider the formulation of its answer and the reasons provided in the attached explanatory note to be sufficiently clear. To meet the latter reaction with fraternal charity, it seems opportune to take up the theme again and offer a vision that draws together the doctrinal aspects with the pastoral ones in a coherent manner because, quote, all religious teaching ultimately has to be reflected in the teacher's way of life, which awakens the assent of the heart by its nearness, love, and witness. In other words, we have to practice this faith. So it's got to be understood so that it can be put into practice, because the practice of it is what actually brings it into the presence of other people. All right, so what the document is seeking to do is, as an act of fraternal charity, to respond to some request for greater clarification to a document that was published 2 years ago. So this isn't a new issue. This is a clarification of an issue that's already been discussed. All right? Nothing significant so far. Paragraph 4. Pope Francis's recent response to the second of the 5 questions posed by 2 cardinals offers an opportunity to explore this issue further, especially in its pastoral implications or consequences. It is a matter of avoiding that something that is not marriage is being recognized as marriage. Okay, that may be an accusation that's not true. The Church is going to work to clarify that. We are not recognizing, or the Church is not recognizing something as marriage that is not in fact marriage. Therefore, rites and prayers that could create confusion between what constitutes marriage, which is, quote, the exclusive, stable, and indissoluble union between a man and a woman naturally open to the generation of children. So if you have any concern about the Church changing the definition of marriage or granting any idea of gay marriage in the Church, it's just not possible. It's not true. The Church is quoting the traditional teaching on marriage. Marriage is an exclusive, stable, and indissoluble union between a man and a woman, naturally open to the generation of children. That definition of marriage is never going to change, nor is it the subject of this discussion. Obviously, based on that description, gay marriage is impossible. It's impossible. It can never satisfy the conditions of that definition, or I should just say description. Okay? Anything that contradicts it would be inadmissible. This conviction is grounded in the perennial Catholic doctrine of marriage. It is only in this context, that is, in the context of traditional marriage, only in this context that sexual relations find their natural, proper, and fully human meaning. There is no confusion on this question of homosexuality. Marriage is clearly defined, and sexual relations may only take place, morally speaking, within the context of marriage, as defined there. That is where the natural, proper, and fully human meaning of sexual relations takes place, and nowhere else. The Church's doctrine on this point remains firm. So just get any of that controversy out of your head. Anyone who says otherwise is false. This is also the understanding of marriage that is offered by the gospel. For this reason, when it comes to blessings, the Church has the right and duty to avoid any rite that might contradict this conviction or lead to confusion. So the Church is asking, people are coming to the Church. This is the reality. People are coming to the Church. Let's say there's a couple. It's 2 men or 2 women. And they're saying, we understand the Church's teaching on homosexuality. We understand the Church's teaching on marriage. We understand the Church's, but we identify as Catholics, and we want to be members of the Catholic Church. And we understand that this is a complicated issue. We understand that same-sex attraction is something that seems to be real. But we want the help of the Church. We're asking for the Church's help. We're asking for a blessing. And we're going to get into blessings later in this document. We're asking for help. Will the Church give us a blessing and assist us? That's the situation. So the response is the question. They're not asking to be married. The answer to that is no. They're not asking for approval of any sexual relations outside of marriage. The answer is no. So if someone is asking to be married as a gay couple, if there is a gay couple asking to be married by the Catholic Church, the Church teaches very clearly the answer is no. The Church cannot marry same-sex couples. Cannot. The answer is no. If the Church, if someone is asking for the Church to bless a gay marriage, the Church will say no, because that's not acceptable. If they're asking the Church to approve of homosexual activity, the Church says no. The only proper place for sexual relations is within marriage. So there's got to be a situation, and this is what's important here. There's got to be a situation where someone understands all that, is not asking for that, but is simply coming to the Church, expressing a desire for spiritual assistance, is asking for a blessing. And you may say, well, why does anybody need to do that? Well, that's what people say about intercession of saints. They say, well, why does anybody need to pray to saints when you can just pray to Jesus directly? Or why does anybody need to pray to Mary when Jesus says you can pray to the Father directly? Realize that in trying to condemn other people and something like a request for a blessing, you're just going to condemn yourself, because there are things that many of us do that aren't necessary. We're asking whether or not they could be helpful or possible. It's a more complicated question. We're not asking if this is necessary for salvation or if anyone needs to confess this to be necessary for salvation. People are seeking assistance from the Church in the form of blessings, as we all do, The question is there a way that the Church can offer such a person or such a group of people some sort of spiritual assistance or blessing, a source of consolation and strength that properly disposes them for life in the Catholic Church? It's a complicated question that's dealing with an isolated situation. In fact, this situation may never exist. but it's dealing with a specific situation where there's understanding and the church's traditional teaching is in no way compromised. So it's very circumstantial, okay? The church, let's get to paragraph 5 here. This is also the understanding of marriage offered by the gospel. For this reason, when it comes to blessings, we're not talking about sacraments, blessings, the church has the right and the duty, in other words, it has no freedom on this issue, to avoid any rite that might contradict this conviction or lead to confusion with respect to marriage or sexual relations. Such is also the meaning of the responsum of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, which states that the church does not have the power to impart blessings on unions of persons of the same sex. Notice that the church does not have the power to impart blessings on unions. You see how that's a general situation. That would be general. That would be blessing the relationship itself, granting some official recognition of the relation itself. The church does not have the power to do that, and it states clearly that it does not. It does not have the power to impart blessings on unions of persons of the same sex. It should be emphasized that in the rite of the sacrament of marriage, this concerns not just any blessing, but a gesture reserved to the ordained minister. In this case, the blessing given by the ordained minister is tied directly to the specific union of a man and a woman who establish an exclusive and indissoluble covenant by their consent. This fact allows us to highlight the risk of confusing a blessing given to any other union with the rite that is proper to the sacrament of marriage. So, not only are we going to carefully distinguish the church's teaching on gay marriage or homosexual activity, we're also going to be careful not to confuse liturgical activity or rituals or rites, so that there isn't going to be some parallel system of rites where this is like that. There can be no confusion on this issue. It's got to be kept crystal clear. The church is not blessing homosexual relationships. It's not blessing gay unions. It's not marrying gay couples and so on. The church's teaching on that is black and white and unquestionable. So what's going to happen is the church is going to get into this question of blessings, because when someone asks, again, in this hypothetical situation, I understand I can't be married. I understand that the church will not grant recognition of our relationship and so on. Can I as an individual, or can we as two individuals, request a blessing from the church as a same-sex couple? Can we receive a blessing? And so that leads the question, before we answer that, what exactly is a blessing? What exactly is the purpose of a blessing? What are the limits of a blessing? And so on. And one of my friends, I wrote a bit about this the other day, and one of my friends wrote, an example would be holy water. Just think about this. In the church, there's holy water. The dispenser for the holy water is set out, in our church it's in the narthex. In most places it's in the sanctuary. But in our church it's out in the narthex. Before you even get into the sanctuary, there are holy water fonts there. Those holy water fountains, or holy water bowls, whatever you want to call them, dispensaries, they're offered to anyone. Anyone who comes in the church is welcome to take of the holy water. So you can see there an example where this isn't so clear. There's no distinction made between who receives the blessings of holy water and who does not. It's a sacramental. So you see we're getting into this issue of sacramentals and what is the efficacy of sacramentals, who is the proper object of a sacramental, and so on. So when we're asked, or when the church is asked, can a blessing be given, it leads to the question, well, what exactly is a blessing? And this is the investigation that's being pursued here. What exactly is a blessing? What is the church's teaching on blessings? What are the limitations of blessings, and so on? So it's an interesting study. The meaning of various blessings, paragraph 7. The Holy Father's above-mentioned response invites us to broaden and enrich the meaning of blessings. This is what's developing at the present time in this document. The Holy Father's response invites us to broaden and enrich the meaning of blessings. This is what is developing. Blessings are among the most widespread and evolving sacramentals, and this is an important word. If you don't know what a sacramental is, you need to go study the catechism. Just look it up in the catechism, look up sacramentals, and make sure you understand the difference between a sacrament, there are 7 sacraments, and a sacramental. A sacramental is used to help dispose someone to be able to receive grace through the sacraments. A sacramental is considered part of popular devotion. The rosary is a sacramental. Holy water is a sacramental. Making the sign of the cross is a sacramental, and so on. Blessings are among the most widespread and evolving sacramentals. Indeed, they lead us to grasp God's presence in all the events of life and remind us that even in the use of created things, human beings are invited to seek God, to love him, and to serve him faithfully. For this reason, blessings have as their recipients people, objects of worship and devotion, sacred images, places of life, of work, of suffering, the fruits of the earth and human toil, and all created realities that refer back to the Creator, praising and blessing him by their beauty. So when we think about the objects of blessings, we have blessings of pets in some parishes. We have the blessings of houses. We have the blessings of cars. We have the blessings of all sorts of things, all different aspects of our life. The events of life and the use of created things. These things are blessed. We seek blessings upon these things. And it's good for us to reflect and ask ourselves, why do we even do that? If I buy a crucifix for my home, why do I feel like I need to bring that crucifix to the church and ask my priest to bless it before I put it up in my house? Why do we do that? If we buy a new home, why do we think of inviting our priest to come and bless our new home? What is that? It's not necessary, right? It's not necessary. I don't need to have this crucifix blessed in order for it to be valuable as an image of a holy thing, to help elevate my thoughts, to help me pray, and so on. It's not necessary. These things are not necessary. So why do we do them? Why do we do them? That's the question of blessings. Okay? Do our pets need to be blessed? Okay? So we're looking at this. What is the purpose? What is the meaning of this? Paragraph 9. From a strictly liturgical point of view, strictly liturgical, and keep that in mind, strictly liturgical, public, liturgical, universal, etc. A blessing requires that what is blessed be conformed to God's will, as expressed in the teachings of the church. So we're not going to bless sin, right? I'm not going to ask God to bless my, money laundering business as a money laundering business. Indeed, blessings are celebrated by virtue of faith and are ordered to the praise of God and the spiritual benefit of his people. As the Book of Blessings explains, so that this intent might become more apparent, by an ancient tradition, the formulas of blessing are primarily aimed at giving glory to God for his gifts, asking for his favors, and restraining the power of evil in the world. Notice that. That's an important line there. The formulas of blessing are primarily aimed at giving glory to God for his gifts, recognizing God as the source of all things, asking for his favors, expressing our dependence on his help, and restraining the power of evil in the world. Therefore, those who invoke God's blessing through the church are invited to strengthen their dispositions through faith, for which all things are possible, and to trust in the love that urges the observance of God's commandments. That is why, while there is always and everywhere an opportunity to praise God through Christ in the Holy Spirit, there is also a care to do so with things, places, or circumstances that do not contradict the law or the spirit of the gospel. This is a liturgical understanding of blessings, insofar as they are rites officially proposed by the church. So note that this document is making a distinction here. It's saying we can look at blessings from the perspective of strict liturgical understanding, rites, and so on. And we need to take that approach or that way of looking at blessings and set that on one side and say that's one way to approach the question of blessings from a strict liturgical point of view. Right? He says that in paragraph 9, from a strictly liturgical point of view, and explains that in the books that include the formulas for the blessings and the rites for the blessings, the context for the blessings is made very clear. We can't bless sin. It's got to be things that are in conformity with God's will. That's with respect to the strict liturgical point of view regarding blessings. Paragraph 11. Basing itself on these considerations, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith's explanatory note to its 2021 responsum recalls that when a blessing is invoked on certain human relationships by a special liturgical rite, it is necessary that what is blessed corresponds with God's designs written in creation and fully revealed by Christ the Lord. For this reason, since the Church has always considered only those sexual relations that are lived out within marriage to be morally licit or moral, the Church does not have the power to confer its liturgical blessing when that would somehow offer a form of moral legitimacy to a union that presumes to be a marriage or to an extramarital sexual practice. It can't even be considered. The Church does not have the power to confer a liturgical blessing on a relationship that presumes to be a marriage or to any extramarital sexual practice. So that's not even questionable, not the subject of this document. The Holy Father reiterated the substance of this declaration in his respuestas to the dubia of the two cardinals. Paragraph 12. One must avoid the risk of reducing the meaning of blessings to this point alone. Now here's where this gets really important for us to focus, because this is where we're making this distinction, or where the Church is making this distinction. One must avoid the risk of reducing or overly simplifying the meaning of blessings to this strict liturgical perspective alone. This is where the development is taking place through this document. One must avoid the risk of limiting the meaning of blessings to a strict liturgical point of view alone. For this would lead us to expect the same moral conditions for a simple blessing that are called for in the reception of the sacraments. If we have a strict liturgical view of blessings, then the same moral conditions for matrimony would be required for a simple blessing of any kind of liturgical blessing. So can God bless the Boy Scouts in the parish? Can God bless all the women present on Mother's Day? if that blessing has this sort of liturgical strictness to it, then the same moral requirements for the reception of confirmation or holy orders or matrimony would need to be present for those women on Mother's Day, or for those boys on a day when the Boy Scouts are blessed at the parish. And this document argues that that can't be the case. It can't be the case. For it would lead us to expect the same moral conditions for a simple blessing that are called for in the reception of the sacraments. Such a risk requires that we broaden this perspective further. This is what's developing here. We need to broaden this perspective regarding simple blessings. You saw that phrase there, a simple blessing. We need to broaden this perspective. The requirements for a simple blessing cannot be the same, morally speaking, as the requirements for the sacrament of matrimony. We need to broaden this perspective with respect to simple blessings in the church. Indeed, there is the danger that a pastoral gesture, notice the word pastoral has to do with the individual pastoral ministry of an individual priest with an individual soul. Pastoral, it's particular, it's local, it's present, it's personal, and so on. There is a danger that a pastoral gesture that is so beloved and widespread will be subjected to too many moral prerequisites, which under the claim of control could overshadow the unconditional power of God's love that forms the basis for the gesture of blessing. Paragraph 13. Precisely in this regard, Pope Francis urged us not to, quote, lose pastoral charity, which should permeate all our decisions and attitudes, and to avoid being, quote, judges who only deny, reject, and exclude. Let us then respond to the Holy Father's proposal by developing a broader understanding of blessings. And as I was reading this, I have to admit, as I was reading this, what I thought to myself is, when I first became a Christian, when I first attended church after years and years of not even being at church or anything, I was a filthy person. I was an immoral person. I was filled with all kinds of worldly garbage. I knew nothing of the Christian faith. And I never thought twice of going to church when I decided to return. I never thought, well, I guess I've got to clean myself up first. I guess I've got to, get all these things fixed first. I didn't think that at all. I thought step one is going back to church. Step one is getting myself back in church. I can compare this recently and practically to going to the gym. I haven't been to the gym in a while. I've been very busy. I fell out of shape over the past 6 months or so, and my kids were urging me over Christmas break to go back to the gym with them because they go all the time. And I said, hold on a second. I've got to take some time. I need to do some jogging at home first, get myself back into shape, because I don't even need to be in a gym yet. I could do push-ups and sit-ups and go jog on the road, and I've got plenty of work to do just to get myself back into basic fitness. I wouldn't go to the gym unless I needed more weight than I could get by doing a push-up, or more exertion than I could get by doing sit-ups and so on. So I see the gym as sort of this next level of fitness, this next step where, your basic calisthenics and basic cardio exercise, can be continued at a higher level of intensity that you can't have at home. That's not what the church is. The church isn't the gym. The church is where it all begins. The church is the source of grace that we need for the Christian life. So when we think about the church is not a place that you make yourself perfect by yourself and then go to, like it's the gym, or like it's some kind of date night. The church is actually the means by which we acquire the strength to change ourselves. So it starts with returning to the church. It starts with approaching the church and asking for assistance, not the other way around. It's not like going to the gym. Okay, so this document sets out to develop a broader understanding of blessings. We're not talking about sacraments, so get all that controversy out of the way. We're not talking about whether homosexuality is allowed or approved by the church. That's already been addressed. There are no sexual activity, no sexual relations outside of marriage that are morally licit as far as the church is concerned. It's already been stated, already been dealt with, already off the table. Okay? The subject here is understanding blessings in a broader sense from a pastoral point of view. Very, very specific focus, very specific subject of this document, and the church has done a very good job of clarifying that and freeing itself from any stupid criticism from people who don't read the document and just make accusations that don't even apply to what's being discussed here. We're talking about blessings. And even further, if we were to divide even further, we're not talking about blessings from a strict liturgical perspective, but from a simple pastoral perspective. So we've got this divided and divided and divided down into one specific subject, and that's the context of what's being said here. Let's keep going. To reflect on blessings by gathering different points of view, we first need to be enlightened by the voice of Scripture. So let's go see what the Scriptures say about blessings. Quote, "May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace." Quote from Numbers chapter 6 from the Law of Moses. This priestly blessing we find in the Old Testament, specifically in the book of Numbers, has a descending character, since it represents the invocation of a blessing that descends from God upon man. It is one of the oldest texts of divine blessing, and the Law of Moses was written around 1400 BC. That's the first type of blessing, this priestly blessing that has this sort of condescending nature to it. Then there is a second type of blessing we find in the biblical pages, that which ascends from earth to heaven toward God. Blessing in this second sense amounts to praising, celebrating, and thanking God for his mercy and faithfulness, for the wonders he has created, and for all that has come about by his will. Quote, "Bless the Lord, my soul, and all that is within me, bless his holy name." Psalm 103. So we've got two different kinds of blessings we see, one that comes down from God to man, one that goes up from man to God in the form of praise or thanksgiving. Paragraph 16. To God who blesses, we also respond by blessing. Melchizedek, the king of Salem, blesses Abram in Genesis 14. Rebekah is blessed by her family members before she becomes the bride of Isaac in Genesis 24, who in turn blesses his son, Jacob, in Genesis 27. Jacob blesses Pharaoh in Genesis 47, his own grandsons, Ephraim and Manasseh, and his 12 sons. Moses and Aaron bless the community in Exodus and Leviticus. The heads of households bless their children at weddings, before embarking on a journey and in the imminence of death. These blessings appear to be a superabundant and unconditional gift, mainly because they're blessings that are given to communities of people, to groups. They're not individualized blessings. So when Moses and Aaron blessed the community of the Hebrews, was that whole community, this community of perfect saints that were receiving this blessing? No. The blessing was a superabundant and unconditional gift. It was grace. It was a blessing, a grace upon the people. All right, paragraph 17. The blessing found in the New Testament retains essentially the same meaning it had in the Old Testament. We find the divine gift that descends, the human thanksgiving that ascends, and the blessing imparted by man that extends toward others. So 3 species of blessings: that which descends, that which ascends, and that which extends. It seems like vertical in the sense of descending and ascending, and then horizontal in extending. So that's simple for us to understand. There's 3 species of blessings: descending, ascending, and extending. Zechariah, having regained the use of speech, the father of John the Baptist, blesses the Lord for his wondrous works in Luke chapter 1. Simeon, the old man in the temple, while holding the newborn Jesus in his arms, blesses God for granting him the grace to contemplate the saving Messiah, and then blesses the child's parents, Mary and Joseph. Jesus blesses the Father in the famous hymn of praise and exaltation he addressed to him: "I praise you, O Father, Lord of heaven and earth." Paragraph 18. In continuity with the Old Testament, in Jesus as well, the blessing is not only ascending, referring to the Father, but is also descending, being poured out on others as a gesture of grace, protection, and goodness. Jesus himself implemented and promoted this practice. For example, he blessed children. He took them in his arms and blessed them, laying his hands upon them. And you can see there how the question of the baptism of infants also relates to this question of who is the appropriate object of a blessing, right? What makes a child appropriate? What makes an infant appropriate for the sacrament of baptism, which is much more serious than a simple blessing? We would argue that it's God's grace that makes it acceptable to baptize an infant who has not expressed faith, who has made no voluntary action or movement towards God at all. A child is able to be baptized by God's grace. And so we see that this idea that even when Jesus blesses the children, these children are all undeveloped. They may not even have reached the age of reason yet. Why would they be blessed? They haven't proven themselves worthy yet. If blessings come with conditions, how can children be blessed? How can babies be baptized? Jesus took the children in his arms and he blessed them, laying his hands upon them. And Jesus' earthly journey will end precisely with a final blessing reserved for the 11 shortly before he ascends to the Father. And lifting up his hands, he blessed them. And while he blessed them, he parted from them and was carried up into heaven. The last image of Jesus on earth is that of his hands being raised in the act of blessing. That's the significance of blessing. The last image of Jesus on earth is that of his hands being raised in the act of blessing. Paragraph 19. In his mystery of love, through Christ, God communicates to his church the power to bless. Granted by God to human beings and bestowed by them on their neighbors, the blessing is transformed into inclusion, solidarity, and peacemaking. Let's read that again. Paragraph 19. In his mystery of love, through Christ, God communicates to his church the power to bless. Granted by God to human beings and bestowed by them on their neighbors, the blessing is transformed into inclusion, solidarity, and peacemaking. It is a positive message of comfort, care, and encouragement. The blessing expresses God's merciful embrace and the church's motherhood, which invites the faithful to have the same feelings as God toward their brothers and sisters. In other words, if you would deny the right of a pastor to grant a blessing to some other person because of some condition, you would have to believe that God does not bless people in that condition. And that's explicitly denied in the scriptures. He pours rain upon the righteous and the unrighteous, the scripture says. He gives food and clothing to the Christian and the non-Christian, to the Jew and the Gentile. All of these things are blessings from God. We give thanks for our daily meals because we acknowledge our food and drink and everything that we need to come from God. Well, he's also giving all of those things to our non-Christian neighbors. So the unbelievers of the world, the sinners of the world, as if we're not included in that, they're already receiving blessings from God. Part of the problem in their life is that they're not giving thanks for those blessings, but they're already receiving good things from God. They're already receiving them. And the blessing that we are given the power to extend to others, even as lay people, there are blessings that we're given authority to offer to our neighbors and relatives and children and so on. These things are given to help us to move forward, to live better, and to respond to the Lord's will. And they're signs of God's mercy and goodness to us. I don't know why anyone would have a difficult time with that. Paragraph 20. One who asks for a blessing, and notice again, we're limiting the audience that's being spoken of here. We're limiting the subject. One who asks for a blessing. So this is not a universal statement. It's not a universal statement about anybody in the world. We're assuming that a person is coming and asking for a blessing. And we're talking about that person specifically, or that person in particular. We're not talking about everybody else. We're talking about the person who asks for a blessing. One who asks for a blessing. People who hate God, who hate the church, they're not asking for blessings. We're talking about one who is asking for a blessing. One who asks for a blessing shows himself to be in need of God's saving presence in his life. And one who asks for a blessing from the church recognizes the church as a sacrament of the salvation that God offers. To seek a blessing in the church is to acknowledge that the life of the church springs from the womb of God's mercy and helps us to move forward, to live better, and to respond to the Lord's will. There's an acknowledgement taking place. There's a verse in the New Testament that says, if anyone confesses that Jesus is the Christ, he does so by the grace of God, right? No one will confess the gospel unless he's moved to do so by God. Jesus says, no one can come to me unless the Father draws him. And so you can see that this movement to approach the church and ask for a blessing is not something that comes naturally from fallen human nature. It's something that is provoked by grace, and it should be met with grace. One who asks for a blessing shows himself to already be disposed towards God and the church in a certain way. It's important to note that. Like I said, people who hate the church, they don't go to church. They don't ask the church to help them. They want to go as far from church as they can get, like Adam in the garden, hiding from God. Paragraph 21. In order to help us understand the value of a more pastoral approach to blessings, Pope Francis urges us to contemplate. This is what's important. Pope Francis urges us to contemplate with an attitude of faith and fatherly mercy. In other words, if you're not merciful, you can't even contemplate what the Holy Father is asking us to think about because you're not properly disposed. He urges us to contemplate with an attitude of faith and fatherly mercy the fact that, quote, when one asks for a blessing, one is expressing a petition for God's assistance. One is expressing a plea to live better and confidence in a Father who can help us live better. we're asked to contemplate this fact. When one asks for a blessing, he is expressing a petition for God's assistance, a plea to live better, and confidence in a Father who can help us live better. This request should in every way be valued, accompanied, and received with gratitude because it is not natural. This request should be received with grace. People who come spontaneously to ask for a blessing show by this request their sincere openness and openness to transcendence, the confidence of their hearts that they do not trust in their own strength alone, their need for God, and their desire, however weak or faint it may be, their desire to break out of the narrow confines of this world, enclosed in its limitations, a desire to not be normal. I was surprised a few months ago. I saw that there was a place, I think it was in California, where there was an organization that was providing safe places for people to use their drugs. And I remember hearing that and thinking to myself, what a bunch of ridiculous nonsense. That sort of initial visceral response that we give to things. But I continued watching this documentary, listening to the discussions, and one of the nurses who worked in this clinic said that for many of these people, they live in such terrible conditions every day, and they're free to do so. They're free to continue to do so. For them to come into a clinic and say, I would like to use my drugs in a safer, cleaner manner, is a huge step for them. It's a huge step for them. And so they receive them and they help them to improve their condition just one step better, just to make things one step better, because that's all that they're capable of. They're not capable of jumping back into perfect, happy, healthy life, but they can make this one slight step, this one slight movement, and that slight movement, they argued, needs to be received thankfully and given attention to. I think that's the message here, that when someone comes forward and asks for a blessing or asks for the church's assistance, we have to realize that however slight it may be, rather than criticize it, however slight it may be, we need to recognize that this is an expression of their desire to improve. And so it's like starting a fire and having a real faint glow in the fire and cultivating that and helping it to pick up and fanning the flame, as it were, and getting the fire going. We've got to realize that faint light is fire, right? If there's smoke, there's fire, we say. That faint expression of a desire for a blessing or for assistance is a sign that there's fire present, and we need to fan that fire and receive it and support it and cultivate it and help it to grow, not quench it, which would be the worst thing we could possibly do. And you can see that what people are doing in the church is they are quenching these faint fires, these slight desires. They see them, they hear them, and for some bizarre, perverted reason, they think that the right thing to do is to stomp it out, as if that's the Christian response. Really makes no sense at all. What if somebody would have stomped out your initial faith, your initial requests for help, your initial efforts to begin a Christian life, to convert and change your life? What if someone met you and just stomped out your efforts? You likely didn't receive that. You likely were met by people who helped them and fanned the flame, as it was, and helped it to grow. I know I certainly was. Paragraph 22. As St. Therese of the Child Jesus teaches us, this confidence in God's mercy is the sole path that leads us to the love that grants everything. With confidence, the wellspring of grace overflows into our lives. It is most fitting, then, that we should place heartfelt trust not in ourselves, but in the infinite mercy of a God who loves us unconditionally. The sin of the world is great, but not infinite, whereas the merciful love of the Redeemer is indeed infinite. As bad as the sin may be, and you see, this is where we need to grow and where we need to be formed. We need to change. We need to think better. As bad as the sin may be, as offensive as it may be, as difficult as it may be for us, the sin is not infinite, and yet God's mercy is infinite. God's mercy is greater. God can comprehend people's sins. We can't necessarily. The sin of the world is great, St. Therese says, but not infinite, whereas the merciful love of the Redeemer is indeed infinite. Paragraph 23. When considered outside of a liturgical framework, these expressions of faith are found in a realm of greater spontaneity and freedom. Nevertheless, the optional nature of pious exercises should in no way be taken to imply an underestimation or even disrespect for such practices. We're talking about optional things here. The way forward in this area requires a correct and wise appreciation of the many riches of popular piety. And I recommend, if you're not sure what popular piety means, look it up in the Catechism, because the Catechism speaks about what popular piety is. It's worth looking into. The way forward in this area with respect to blessings in the Church requires a correct and wise appreciation of the many riches of popular piety and the potentiality of these same riches. In this way, blessings become a pastoral resource to be valued rather than a risk or a problem. In this way, if we think in this way, pastoral blessings become valued, a valued resource, rather than a risk or a problem that needs to be worried about. From the point of view of pastoral care, which again, for most of us is none of our business. I'm not a pastor. I could say that I have some responsibility for pastoral care with respect to my own children or people who actually come to me. I have to treat them as a father, as a shepherd would. But this is more specifically talking about the pastoral care of the Church's actual ordained ministers who are dealing with these things directly. From the point of view of pastoral care, blessings should be evaluated as acts of devotion that are external to the celebration of the Holy Eucharist and of the other sacraments. So we shouldn't conflate these things and get them all mixed up. Indeed, the language, rhythm, course, and theological emphasis of popular piety differ from those of the corresponding liturgical action. And for this reason, pious practices must conserve their proper style, simplicity, and language, and attempts to impose forms of liturgical celebration, in quotes there, on them are to be avoided. In other words, popular piety is supposed to be popular. And popular, that doesn't mean famous. It means it belongs to the people. Popular piety is local. It's cultural, and so on. Popular piety is personal. It doesn't need to be made strict and formal and liturgical as the sacraments do. Popular piety is the piety of people. It's cultural, it's local, it's unique, and so on. It's not to be made formal. Paragraph 25, the Church must shy away from resting its pastoral praxis on the fixed nature of certain doctrinal or disciplinary schemes, especially when they lead to, quote, a narcissistic and authoritarian elitism, whereby instead of evangelizing, one analyzes and classifies others. And instead of opening the door to grace, one exhausts his or her energies in inspecting and verifying. Yeah, that's such a clear description of our tendency, right? Our tendency is, we want everything and everyone to help us. We want to be the recipients. We want our way to be made easier. We want everyone else to serve us and help us, and that's just natural and understandable. Therefore, we don't want to let bad people in. We don't want to let the dumb kids into a school. We don't want to let the crippled kids into the club. That's just a natural, selfish response, and we understand it as such. But reason has to counteract that natural, selfish, irrational response and lead us to judge justly. So all of those attitudes towards people who are not like us, they're all just natural. They're all based on our passions and our natural selfishness and so on. Very clearly described there. Christians think that their job is to sort of keep the door, to keep people out, to analyze and classify other people, to exhaust their energies in inspecting and verifying. So clearly described. Thus, when people ask for a blessing, this screwed up disposition responds in a way that makes no sense. When people ask for a blessing, an exhaustive moral analysis should not be placed as a precondition for conferring that blessing. For those seeking a blessing should not be required to have prior moral perfection. No duh, right? What the church is teaching here is so obvious. We all know this because this is how we treat our own spiritual life. When I go to confession, I go confident that all my sins are going to be absolved and everything's going to be fine because God is merciful and God loves me and I trust in God's mercy. And I go there knowing that I've got all kinds of junk to confess, but everything's going to be okay. And I expect that reception from the church. I know my priest, he's going to be supportive and smiling and encouraging and comforting. No matter what I confess, I'm going to be met with welcome and comfort and encouragement every time. I know that. I expect it. And yet, when it's time for us to deal with someone else, we do everything to the contrary. Obviously, that can't be true. Those seeking a blessing should not be required to have prior moral perfection, just as we do not have to have prior moral perfection before we receive the blessings, even the sacraments themselves that we seek. Paragraph 26. In this perspective, the Holy Father's Respuestas aid in expanding the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith's 2021 pronouncement from a pastoral point of view. For the Respuestas invite discernment concerning the possibility of forms of blessing requested by one or more persons that do not convey an erroneous conception of marriage. And in situations that are morally unacceptable from an objective point of view, account for the fact that pastoral charity requires us not to treat simply as sinners those whose guilt or responsibility may be attenuated by various factors affecting subjective imputability. Now, there's a lot of complicated language there. But in other words, there's more to people's circumstances than just, doctrinal definitions of different sins and things like that. People are also living in different circumstances. They've also been under different influences. There's different norms in the culture that they're raised in the families that they're raised in the communities that they're raised in. And many of the things they do, they may have learned to do by imitation of things around them. And many of us are free from those things. So there is a subjective imputability. That means a subjective guilt or degree of guilt based on circumstances. And so even though something may be considered to be immoral objectively, as far as the book goes, or as the law goes, there's more to it from a pastoral perspective that considers subjective imputability. And I can give a practical example of this. In my own family life with my children, I live a very busy life. My wife lives a very busy life. And often our children pay the price of that life in certain ways, different ways. I experienced the same thing. My parents were busy working, doing things, and I paid the price for some of those things. So if somebody were to meet me when I was 16 years old, I'm not this free bird who everything that I do is my chosen ideal. Like there were things that I developed from habits of people who were in my life. I went to public schools, had relatives who were rascals, introduced me to all kinds of bad stuff. So if you met me and found all this bad stuff in me, it wasn't that I was dropped onto a desert island and sought it all out by myself. Much of it I just absorbed from the community around me. And so there's a subjective imputability of the evil that's seen present in me. The same thing with my children, like I was saying. When my children are acting in a way that I don't like, they're pursuing something that I don't like, choosing something I don't like, acting in a certain way I don't like, it's very easy for me to blow up and get angry and respond critical and, yelling at them and whatever else. But what I've learned to do is to first ask myself whether there's anything that I'm doing or any circumstance that I'm responsible for that is putting them in a place where they would want to do that, where they would feel that that was the better option of other options. And in most circumstances, I find that there are things that I am responsible for, that I'm causing, that's influencing them in a certain way. And before I say a word to them, before I talk to them about it, before I offer any criticism, before I try to correct them in any way, I remove those things first. I remove those causes. I make sure that anything that could be a cause is taken away, and then I leave them with time, and I see how they respond. And if I find that taking away the causes that I was responsible for takes away the problem, then I confirm that I was the actual cause of that behavior. But if I see that in some way they then continue to seek it out on their own, then I see that it's a problem they have, and it's more objective. But that's the idea of subjective imputability. They're not necessarily as guilty as they appear, because there may be other influences that are leading them or rubbing off on them or molding them to have certain bad habits or vices that really aren't their own choosing. And so it's subjective, okay? In situations that are morally unacceptable from an objective point of view, account for the fact that pastoral charity requires us not to treat simply as sinners, all equal, those whose guilt or responsibility may be attenuated by various factors affecting subjective imputability. We've got to consider circumstances, and that's just how moral philosophy works. 27. That's how justice works even in courts. In the catechesis cited at the beginning of this declaration, Pope Francis proposed a description of this kind of blessing that is offered to all without requiring anything. It is worth reading these words with an open heart, for they help us to grasp the pastoral meaning of blessings offered without preconditions. It is God who blesses. In the first pages of the Bible, there is a continual repetition of blessings. God blesses, but humans also give blessings. And soon it turns out that the blessing possesses a special power which accompanies those who receive it throughout their lives and disposes man's heart, prepares man, disposes his heart to be changed by God. So notice the influence of a blessing. Disposes man's heart to be changed by God. So we are more important to God than all the sins we can commit, because he is Father, he is Mother, he is pure love. He has blessed us forever. He will never stop blessing us. It is a powerful experience to read these biblical texts of blessing in a prison or in a rehabilitation group, to make those people feel that they are still blessed, notwithstanding their serious mistakes, that their Heavenly Father continues to will their good and to hope that they will ultimately open themselves to the good, even if their closest relatives have abandoned them because they now judge them to be irredeemable. God always sees them as his children. Pretty beautiful. Paragraph 28. There are several occasions when people spontaneously ask for a blessing, whether on pilgrimages, at shrines, or even on the street when they meet a priest. By way of example, we can refer to the Book of Blessings, which provides several rites for blessing people, including the elderly, the sick, participants in a catechetical or prayer meeting, pilgrims, those embarking on a journey, volunteer groups, associations, and more. Such blessings are meant for everyone. No one is to be excluded from them. In the introduction to the Order for the Blessing of Elderly People, for example, it is stated that the purpose of this blessing is, quote, so that the elderly themselves may receive from their brethren a testimony of respect and gratitude, while together with them we give thanks to the Lord for the favors they received from him and for the good they did with his help. In this case, the subject of the blessing is the elderly person, for whom and with whom thanks is being given to God for the good he has done and for the benefits he has received. No one can be prevented from this act of giving thanks, and each person, even if he or she lives in situations that are not ordered to the Creator's plan, possesses positive elements for which we can praise the Lord. Paragraph 29. From the perspective of the ascending dimension, when one becomes aware of the Lord's gifts and his unconditional love, even in sinful situations, particularly when a prayer finds a hearing, the believer's heart lifts its praise to God and blesses him. No one is precluded from this type of blessing. Everyone, individually or together with others, can lift their praise and gratitude to God. Paragraph 30. The popular understanding of blessings, however, also values the importance of descending blessings. While it is not appropriate for a diocese, a bishop's conference, or any other ecclesial structure to constantly and officially establish procedures or rituals for all kinds of matters, pastoral prudence and wisdom, avoiding all serious forms of scandal and confusion among the faithful, may suggest that the ordained minister join in the prayer of those persons who, although in a union that cannot be compared in any way to a marriage, desire to entrust themselves to the Lord and his mercy, to invoke his help, and to be guided to a greater understanding of his plan of love and truth. Let's read that again. The popular understanding of blessings also values the importance of descending blessings. So not just gratitude, but also seeking gifts and blessings from God, seeking grace from God. While it is not appropriate for a diocese or a bishop's conference or any other ecclesial structure to constantly and officially establish procedures or rituals for all kinds of matters. In other words, the ability of groups within the church to make policies for groups of people and circumstances is restricted. Pastoral prudence and wisdom, that is individual individual pastoral prudence, avoiding all serious forms of scandal and confusion among the faithful. Pastoral prudence and wisdom may suggest that the ordained minister, so again, this is, for most of us, this is none of our business. The ordained minister may join in the prayer of those persons who, although in a union that cannot be compared in any way to a marriage, desire to entrust themselves to the Lord in his mercy. Notice this is laying out the conditions for this permission. The ordained minister may join in the prayer of people who desire to entrust themselves to the Lord and to his mercy, to invoke his help, and who desire to be guided to a greater understanding of his plan of love and truth. If those desires are present, and notice this is conditional, if those desires are present, and we can realize what an extraordinarily isolated situation this would be. If someone comes to the church and asks for a blessing, they desire to entrust themselves to the Lord in his mercy, they desire to invoke his help, they desire to be guided to greater understanding. They're willing to learn. They want to learn and understand. They want to grow. They're not stubborn. They're not defiant, anything like that. They're humble and docile, and they're asking for God's help. If that's the case, then pastoral prudence and wisdom may suggest, still even there, may suggest that the ordained minister join in the prayer of those persons. So we're talking about very, very specific, isolated circumstances that are to be judged by a pastor according to pastoral prudence and wisdom. There's no controversy here. Paragraph 31. This section is the blessing of couples in irregular situations and of couples of the same sex. So now we start to really zoom in on the subject. Paragraph 31. Within the horizon outlined here appears the possibility of blessings for couples in irregular situations and for couples of the same sex, the form of which should not be fixed ritually by ecclesial authorities, to avoid producing confusion with the blessing proper to the sacrament of marriage. So this is not going to be some big show, this big wide-scale change in the church, not some universal policy or some new source of, there's going to be these new rites and rituals in the church. In such cases, a blessing may be imparted that not only has an ascending value, but also involves the invocation of a blessing that descends from God upon those who, recognizing themselves, again, notice the restrictions and qualifications again, who, recognizing themselves to be destitute and in need of God's help, do not claim a legitimation of their own status, but who beg that all that is true, good, and humanly valid in their lives and their relationships be enriched, healed, and elevated by the presence, the invoked presence of the Holy Spirit. Again, notice all of those conditions. This isn't the church now approves homosexuality, the church now approves gay marriage. There are so many conditions. We're talking about one particular disposition of soul found in a special person or a special group of people that merits this blessing. The church has provided such careful explanation of the conditions that anyone who doesn't read this and doesn't respect what the church has actually written, they just reveal their own sin. They just reveal their own disposition. We can see what the church is teaching. It's very, very clear and specific. These forms of blessing express a supplication that God may grant those aids that come from the impulses of his Spirit, what classical theology calls actual grace, so that human relationships may mature and grow in fidelity to the gospel, that they may be freed from their imperfections and frailties, and that they may express themselves in the ever-increasing dimension of the divine love, that they may grow and actually come to a more perfect love. That's the idea of the blessing. I can give a quick story, relates to this, from a friend of ours, a friend of my wife's actually. We know a woman, I don't know her too well, but my wife is friends with her. We know a woman who was actually raised by a gay couple of women. There was this couple, these two women. Apparently they adopted this girl. They adopted her and they raised her, and she never even thought much about it. She never thought much about it. They seemed like they were friends, and she was raised by, it was her and other children as well, kind of like a foster child situation, I think, where there were other children involved too, and they were being cared for and raised by these two women, and they didn't think much of it, and later she learned that they were actually a gay couple, and it wasn't even really known. Well, later on, as those two women got older, those two women became nuns. And so I think in that relationship we see what this is talking about, that what might be imperfect and frail in the beginning might have some spark of goodness in it that needs to be fanned and can grow into something more perfect. And again, I'm just presenting that as an example where I can see that what the church is describing here as the potential for those relationships when they come under the influence of God's grace, they can actually take what's there that's good, because there is something that's good there. There is something that's good there. Just like, as I said before, with the drug user who wants to take his drugs in a clean environment, there's something good there. There's a good impulse at work there, and we should recognize that. In the same way, if somebody just wants to be an immoral person, they can just go do so. They can go be immoral if they want to. The fact that they want to enter a relationship, commit to a certain person, share in a life, love one another, and so on, there's something good there, because it doesn't need to be like that. They don't need to do that. There's something good there. And that which is good is what is being asked to be blessed and sort of fanned into something even more perfect. That seems to be the idea here. Paragraph 32. Indeed, the grace of God works in the lives of those who do not claim to be righteous, but who acknowledge themselves humbly as sinners. Hopefully all of us do this, like everyone else. And you can see how this document is sort of causing us, or should be causing us, to judge ourselves. Like, have I lost my mind with respect to my own salvation? God works in the lives of those who do not claim to be righteous, but who acknowledge themselves humbly as sinners, like everyone else. This grace can orient everything according to the mysterious and unpredictable designs of God. Therefore, with its untiring wisdom and motherly care, the Church welcomes all who approach God with humble hearts, accompanying them with those spiritual aids that enable everyone to understand and realize God's will fully in their existence. The Church welcomes all. No, that's not what the Church says. The Church qualifies this and says, the Church welcomes all who approach God with humble hearts. And notice that many Catholics who criticize the Pope and bishops, they may be the ones excluded by this qualification. They may be the ones who are actually in more spiritual trouble. The Church welcomes those who approach God with humble hearts, accompanying them with spiritual aids that enable everyone to understand and realize God's will fully in their existence. Paragraph 33. This is a blessing that, although not included in any liturgical rite, it's not going to be some public, general, formal thing, unites intercessory prayer with the invocation of God's help by those who humbly turn to him. And that disposition of humility is to be judged by the minister. Right? That's why it's considered pastoral. It's to be a case-by-case basis where the minister would discern that the disposition of the persons is what it should be. It should be humble, destitute, like it mentioned before. It's none of our business. It's not general. It doesn't apply to everybody. It's an individual case-by-case basis left to the minister to judge individual dispositions. God never turns away anyone who approaches him! Exclamation point. Ultimately, a blessing offers people a means to increase their trust in God. The request for a blessing expresses and nurtures openness to the transcendence, mercy, and closeness to God in 1,000 concrete circumstances of life, or concrete circumstances of life, which is no small thing in the world in which we live. These blessings, as seemingly irrelevant as they may be, they're not irrelevant. It is a seed of the Holy Spirit that must be nurtured, not hindered. Paragraph 34. The Church's liturgy itself invites us to adopt this trusting attitude, even in the midst of our sins, lack of merits, weaknesses, confusions, as witnessed by this beautiful collect from the Roman Missal. Quote, Almighty, ever-living God, who in the abundance of your kindness surpass the merits and desires of those who entreat you, pour out your mercy upon us to pardon what conscience dreads and to give what prayer does not dare to ask. How often, through a pastor's simple blessing, which does not claim to sanction or legitimize anything, can people experience the nearness of the Father beyond all merits and desires? And again, this just asks us to consider others with the same mercy and kindness that we treat ourselves with. There's nothing controversial in this. Therefore, the pastoral sensibility of ordained ministers should also be formed to perform blessings spontaneously that are not found in the Book of Blessings. 36. In this sense, it is essential to grasp the Holy Father's concern that these non-ritualized blessings, so this is not formal, general, public, non-ritualized blessings never cease being simple gestures that provide an effective means of increasing trust in God on the part of the people who ask for them. Careful that they should not become a liturgical or even semi-liturgical act similar to a sacrament. So if anyone were to take this and run with it and start organizing huge events and things that look like marriage, they're contradicting the actual teaching of the Church. So there's nothing to fear. We're talking about private, non-ritualized blessings administered by individual priests. Indeed, or I should say ordained ministers, because I'm assuming deacons could be involved in this as well. I'm not sure. Indeed, such a ritualization would constitute a serious impoverishment because it would subject a gesture of great value in popular piety to excessive control, depriving ministers of freedom and spontaneity in their pastoral accompaniment of people's lives. In other words, these blessings are to be considered part of what's called popular piety in the Church. They're not to be brought into the formal, public, liturgical life of the Church. This is a part of popular piety. Paragraph 37. In this regard, there come to mind the following words of the Holy Father, already quoted in part. Quote, decisions that may be part of pastoral prudence in certain circumstances should not necessarily become a norm. That is to say, it is not appropriate for a diocese, bishop's conference, or any other ecclesial structure to constantly, and officially establish procedures or rituals for all kinds of matters. Canon law should not and cannot cover everything, nor should the Episcopal conferences claim to do so with their various documents and protocols. Since the life of the Church flows through many channels besides the normative ones. In other words, there has to be room left for private judgment by individual ministers in special circumstances. And Pope Francis is leaving that room in the Church's practice for something like these blessings. Thus, Pope Francis recalled that, quote, what is part of a practical discernment in particular circumstances cannot be elevated to the level of a general rule. I added general there. Level of a rule, because this would lead to an intolerable casuistry. Paragraph 38. For this reason, one should neither provide for nor promote a ritual for the blessings of couples in an irregular situation. There's no ritual to develop out of this. At the same time, one should not prevent or prohibit the Church's closeness to people in every situation in which they might seek God's help through a simple blessing. In a brief prayer preceding this spontaneous blessing, the ordained minister could ask that the individuals have peace, health, a spirit of patience, dialogue, and mutual assistance, but also God's light and strength to be able to fulfill his will completely. In any case, precisely to avoid any form of confusion or scandal, when the prayer of blessing is requested by a couple in an irregular situation, even though it is expressed outside the rites prescribed by the liturgical books, this blessing should never be imparted in concurrence with the ceremonies of a civil union, and not even in connection with them. There should be no connection between these blessings and any sort of marriage ceremony or liturgical celebration. Nor can it be performed with any clothing, gestures, or words that are proper to a wedding. No tuxedo, no wedding gown, etc. The same applies when blessing is requested by a same-sex couple. Such a blessing may instead find its place in other contexts, such as a visit to a shrine, a meeting with a priest, a prayer recited in a group or during a pilgrimage. Indeed, through these blessings that are given not through the ritual forms proper to the liturgy, but as an expression of the Church's maternal heart, similar to those that emanate from the core of popular piety, there is no intention to legitimize anything. It's not an approval of anything, but rather to open one's life to God, to ask for his help to live better, and also to invoke the Holy Spirit so that the values of the gospel may be lived with greater or increasing faithfulness. What has been said in this declaration regarding the blessings of same-sex couples is sufficient to guide the prudent and fatherly discernment of ordained ministers. Thus, beyond the guidance provided above, no further responses should be expected about possible ways to regulate the details or practicalities regarding blessings of this type. Otherwise, if they get into more and more details, then we'll end up with a rite. And the whole point of this is we don't want there to be some formal rite. All right, getting down to the end of this. The Church continues to lift up those prayers. This is paragraph 42. The Church continues to lift up those prayers and supplications that Christ himself, with loud cries and tears, offered in his earthly life, and which enjoy a special efficacy for this reason. In this way, quote, not only by charity, example, and works of penance, but also by prayer, does the ecclesial community exercise a true maternal function in bringing souls to Christ. Paragraph 43. The church is thus the sacrament of God's infinite love. Therefore, even when a person's relationship with God is clouded by sin, he can always ask for a blessing, stretching out his hand to God, as Peter did in the storm when he cried out to Jesus, "Lord, save me." Indeed, desiring and receiving a blessing can be the possible good in some situations. Pope Francis reminds us that, quote, "a small step in the midst of great human limitations can be more pleasing to God than a life which appears outwardly in order but moves through the day without confronting great difficulties." In other words, moral merit is relative to obstacles and difficulties. In this way, quote, "what shines forth is the beauty of the saving love of God made manifest in Jesus Christ, who died and rose from the dead," unquote. Paragraph 44. Any blessing will be an opportunity for a renewed proclamation of the kerygma, an invitation to draw ever closer to the love of Christ. As Pope Benedict XVI taught, quote, "like Mary, the Church is the mediator of God's blessing for the world. She receives it in receiving Jesus, and she transmits it in bearing Jesus. He is the mercy and peace that the world of itself cannot give, and which it needs always, at least as much as bread," unquote. And lastly, paragraph 45, taking the above points into account and following the authoritative teaching of Pope Francis, this dicastery finally wishes to recall that, quote, "the root of Christian meekness," unquote, is, quote, "the ability to feel blessed and the ability to bless. This world needs blessings, and we can give blessings and receive blessings. The Father loves us, and the only thing that remains for us is the joy of blessing Him, the joy of thanking Him, and of learning from Him to bless," unquote. In this way, every brother and every sister will be able to feel that in the Church they are always pilgrims, always beggars, always loved, and despite everything, always blessed. That's the end of this document. So we've gone through the entire document, read every word, every line, every paragraph. We can see very clearly what the Church is intending to do through this document. We can see that the Church is not offering some political position or platform or statement in any sense. The Church is not speaking in general terms, offering any kind of legitimization or approval of any practices in any abstract sense at all. It's simply focusing on one very, very specific thing, which is the movement of a soul to request help from God and responding to that movement with grace, just as God responds to us with that grace, and also recognizing that when someone does make a move towards God, however small it may be, there's still something of divine inspiration or spiritual impulse behind that movement, and we're to make sure that we fan that and support it rather than quenching it. So it's a good, as much as it may be encouraging and exciting for different groups of people, different individuals in the Church to hear these words from the Vatican and learn of this, when I read this document, I find it to be a very serious warning to those of us who imagine ourselves to be superior to these different groups of people or different circumstances, or who feel upset as if we're insulted that they're included in our club and so on. I find it to be a very sobering warning to examine ourselves and ask, am I going crazy as a Christian? Am I really losing my mind and imagining that my sins and the mercy that I've received and the patience with which God has dealt with me through these years, the mercy and kindness I continue to expect every day from the Church should not be extended to other people? Am I really that crazy to think that I deserve mercy and I deserve grace and patience and kindness and forbearance and all these things, and other people don't? Can I really be that crazy as a Christian to think that? And I think this document, in this unique way in our time, challenges us to really step back and ask, on what does my salvation depend in the first place? What is my Christianity about in the first place? Is it not true that Christ came into the world to save sinners, and that I myself acknowledge myself to even have an interest in Christianity because of God's prevenient grace that actually goes before our action? Am I to deny that there is such a thing as prevenient grace? And if there is, and I'm the beneficiary of that prevenient grace, am I going to try to block that grace from reaching other people? Have I just gone crazy as a Christian, lost in my own life and affairs? Other people have different strengths than I have. They also have different weaknesses than I have. Am I crazy to think that certain weaknesses are okay and certain weaknesses are not okay? Or not even, I'm not talking weakness or mistake and language like that. I'm talking sins. Am I really to think that my sins are acceptable and forgivable, and yet the sins of someone else are not forgivable? You just see, we can lose our minds, especially, and this is really the danger, I think, when we get wrapped up in temporal cares, when we get wrapped up in material cares, when we're competing against other people most of the time, competing for control of material things. And this is what we see in politics, for example, where we're angry that these people are getting government funds, or these people are getting these benefits. We want only our group to get those benefits. What we're really doing is scratching and clawing about material stuff. And when we do that, we allow our desire for material things, our desire for temporal benefits, to actually look at our neighbors as competitors and opponents. And you can see how we don't want our neighbors to receive any good. We don't want our neighbors to be blessed. We don't want our neighbors to receive help. We don't want our neighbors to enjoy the things that we have access to. We want to like isolate the church as our personal spiritual care system and not allow anybody else in. And we're just nuts. We've just gone crazy. And we lose sight of the gospel. We lose sight of our own salvation, our own history, and our ridiculously slow development as Christians, our continued sins and weaknesses. We just ignore all that and pretend that because we're at step 3 instead of step 1, we're somehow, amazing. And the truth is, if you consider how much time we've had, how many benefits we've received, how many graces we've received, and how little we've actually done, we're actually in danger of being judged as less zealous or less sincere than these people making the very first and simplest steps towards God. So we're warned in this document to examine ourselves and ask ourselves if the words we say are even being said thoughtfully and sincerely. For example, at Mass, when we confess that I am not worthy that you should come under my roof, but only say the word and my soul shall be healed. Do we really believe that? I am not worthy that you should come under my roof. When we confess our sins and say the Confiteor at the beginning of Mass, do we really believe that that's true? I have sinned through my fault, through my own most grievous fault. Do I admit that I am sinning? I continue to sin, even though it may be a lesser degree or a lesser extent than it was formerly? Do we acknowledge that we are continuing to sin, even in the presence of greater understanding and greater grace, which makes our sins less excusable? Are we judging ourselves relatively? this document, I think, gives us a good challenge and plenty to think about, plenty to contemplate. And anyway, that's the teaching of the church. So it really doesn't matter what any of us think. It doesn't matter if I like it or don't like it. It doesn't matter if you like it or don't like it. This is Catholicism. And, you and I have the choice to either embrace it or to reject it, but we don't have the authority to overrule it or correct it or change it. I personally trust the church, and I, receive this teaching with an appreciation, largely affected by my own life experiences. I don't know if you know about this, but I'll share it. My daughter, my eldest daughter, when she left home as a young adult, entered into a relationship with another young woman and let us know that she was identifying as a homosexual. And as much as that shocked us, you can imagine all of the Pharisaic, ridiculous drama, right, of the Catholic family finding out. It forced my wife and I to take a deep breath and pray and listen and talk and think and read. And, the complicating factor in our family situation was that my daughter, this girl, is one of the most beautiful and wonderful people that exists in the whole world. And, most of what's said about people in these circumstances, most of the things that are said in the media, most of the things that are said by other Christians, were all objectively false in my daughter's circumstances. And that was the reason that I doubted myself, or in Benjamin Franklin's words, I doubted my own infallibility. And I just continued to study and think and pray and be patient, like the Virgin Mary, pondering all these things in my heart. And as time went on, these circumstances, sort of the initial cloudiness, the fog of the initial craziness, all cleared, and things became very simple. And the church's teaching was very enlightening and helped us to understand how to deal with all of these things. And we enjoy the happiest and most intimate relationship with our daughter. She's actually serving as an intern with the Senate this spring. Just an amazing, intelligent, beautiful young woman who we love and who we know loves us and has an intimate relationship with us, where we communicate every single day. She's here for the holidays. I think we need to really be careful to pump the brakes at this time in history, because there's a lot of confusing influences. There's a lot of really messy, knotty issues to unravel. And we've got to allow the church to guide us through these things. And we'll see that they will unravel. Sometimes things look confusing from a distance, but when we get up into them, we find out that there's not only, horizontal arrangement, but there's also depth to them, and that shows the way through them. I don't know if I'm explaining that idea clearly, but we have to allow the church to direct us and guide us through these complicated things, and trust that if we stay with the church, we will find our way through these things and end up on the truth side in the end, and most importantly, on the side of happiness on the end. So I hope that's helpful. I know it's long, but I think we need to talk about these things, and I can say that we read through every word, every line, every paragraph of this document, and we understand what the church teaches on the pastoral meaning of blessings. I hope that's helpful. God bless.